About a month and a half ago, I made a trip to City Hardwoods in Birmingham, Alabama with Sean Stone to pick up some rough sawn cherry lumber for an upcoming collaborative project. And the project was going to be a makeup vanity for his wife. Now, fast forward about a month after that, and roughly halfway through the project, we realized a critical dimension error that was baked into the design. And I'm laughing about it now because it's kind of embarrassing and frustrating to get this far into a project before realizing a critical error like this. But, guess what? Crap happens. You just move on. So long story short, we tried everything to modify the design, but unfortunately it was a matter of proportions. No matter what we did to the design, it just seemed like the proportions were off. So rather than scrap the material that we already cut up, we decided to divide the already completed work into two new projects. A dartboard cabinet and probably a children's desk, or maybe with just a little bit more design work, a media console of some kind. But basically, that means that all of the video footage we shot for the vanity build is now going to be repurposed for those two projects. So just keep in mind that the videos covering the first half of the build, or video, I don't know how much editing I'm going to do to this, they will be referencing the original vanity design, and about halfway through the build, we'll switch over to the final design. This is the largest piece of lumber we got in our batch. It's 8/4 in thickness, which means it's 2 inches in thickness, and it is 15.5 inches wide and about 8.5 feet in length. This is plenty enough material for all of the leg pieces for the lower cabinets as well as the corner pieces for the upper cabinets. Luckily, all of those pieces are the exact same shape, so it's going to be really easy to lay out all the pieces and get them out of this. But we need to pay attention to the wood grain. We need rift sawn material for all of these and not plain sawn or quarter sawn. So I've got an example piece. I'll bring the camera in closer and show you exactly what I'm talking about. This is a piece of pine. It's southern yellow pine to be exact, and it's a good representation of what we're looking for anytime we have like a table leg or something that is going to be on the corner of a project where you can see it from both the side and you can see it from the front. So, and this half of this board has the grain at about a 45-degree angle on the end grain, somewhat like a 45-degree angle, not exact. And what that gives you is when you view the corner, you see nice straight grain on this face and also nice straight grain on this face. This is what you're looking for anytime you have like a table leg, like I said, or something where you see it from both directions. So if you have something without that 45-degree angle, in this case, this is more of a vertical angle. So when you view it from the front side here, you do have nice straight grain, but because the grain does not come out both faces, it only comes out this face, not this face. This face is not that nice straight grain. This is kind of what you would consider like the cathedral look. You'll have a lot of arches. If this was a wider board, you would see the arches of the wood grain. And individually that may look fine, but when that is one face and straight grain is on the other face, it's just distracting. This doesn't flow visually from one corner or from one face around the corner to the other face. So we want to avoid that. I've taken a marker here and outlined all of the grain so you can get a good idea of how this board is actually looking on the end grain. And I've also taken a little piece of scrap cardboard and cut out a square. The inside area here represents pretty much the final dimension we're trying to shoot for with the legs. So I can put it around here and really get a good idea of how the grain is going to look. Remember, if I go from the inside here, the left and right faces will have some nice straight grain where the grain is coming through, but again, the top and bottom faces will have those cathedrals. We want to avoid that at all costs. So primarily all of our leg pieces are going to be on the outside of the wood. And we can really take this and skew it just slightly to see how much we can exaggerate the exact grain orientation that we want. So this, instead of cutting a square right out of the piece on this corner, if we cut a little bit larger and then mill it so the grain is a little bit more towards the corners, then we should be able to get something really nice out of here. So there's no defects this entire length on the right hand side, so we can go ahead and say that this is going to be four of the corner pieces all the way through its length. And we need a total of 16. So the next one, we can try to get a little bit more on that angle. And as so long as we bandsaw these out, that should be fine. We still have a nice 45-degree angle. This should be pretty good for the second one. So using a little guide like this really does a good job of really determining exactly where you're going to get your pieces and allowing you to lay it out so you do have the best grain. Now, I don't have to perfectly outline my reference lines here. I'm just using this to determine what part of the board that I need. But I did make sure to leave enough on each side to allow for milling and the blade width and all that good stuff. So this will leave us quite a bit on the inside that will be flat sawn or quarter sawn, depending on which direction we look at it, for other parts down the road. Now, we didn't account for this material for any other specific pieces, so we're going to have a lot of extra that we can pull from for anything that comes up. My first step normally is to cross cut when I'm breaking down rough sawn lumber, but in this case, if we just cut this in half and then quarter it off once more over here and once more over there, then what happens to all this center section that's not going to be the legs?
Yeah, we want to try to keep the center section intact as much as possible so we can use it later on.
Absolutely. So instead of cross-cutting first, what we're going to do is rip off about 4.5 inches from each side, and that will leave us the center section fully intact along its entire length, which will give us more options later as far as how far or how long the pieces need to be that we pull from it. So instead of getting too complicated with some material support systems on the bandsaw and trying to wrestle this through the table saw, the easiest thing to do is just break out the old trusty circular saw. As you can see from this face over here, the circular saw had left a lot of burn marks. That's okay, number one, because we're going to further refine the boards and all that will be removed. And number two, that's just the only tool we had to complete the task safely. The best tool for ripping down rough sawn lumber is the bandsaw. But like I said, this is just way too large to be manhandling across my bandsaw setup, so the circular saw was the next best bet. With the center section removed, all of that plain sawn lumber removed, we're left with two nice quarter sawn chunks of wood. We just need to cut this into quarters, in half once and then in half again, so we can start the milling process. Although we did refine the board slightly with a circular saw, I always say that the milling process starts, for me anyway, with a crosscut, and I always use my miter saw. You can also use a circular saw or a jigsaw, but for me it's just convenient to use the miter saw to break down the lumber into shorter, much more manageable pieces to go to the jointer. If I was to try and joint this entire board at one time at the jointer, then I'm going to have to remove quite a bit of material to get a flat plane across its entire length due to any cup, bow, or twist that the board may have. But if I was to cut it into smaller sections and then take it to the jointer, I'm going to remove a lot less material in order to get that board flat. The thing with using a miter saw to do cross-cutting on rough sawn material is if it's rough sawn, then none of your faces are going to be absolutely perfect, including the most important face at the miter saw, which is the face that references off of the fence. So in this case, if I put the board to make the first cut over here, I've got a little bit of bow in it, and it's touching the fence back here, therefore not touching the fence of the saw. If I was to make the cut like this, then this board is probably going to bind and kick into or slam into the fence as I make the cut. So you always want to be mindful of the fence of your saw and make your cuts so that in an order in which all of the pieces are nice and flush with the fence of the saw. It's also worth noting that I positioned my miter saw in relation to my station so that the miter saw fence is forward. So in this case, where there is a little bit of bow and it is very, very close to touching back here, that's okay because it is still firmly touching the fence all the way up here where it really counts. The angled cut we just made at the bandsaw, that angled face is now the first face of what will be the rest of the square for the leg. So we can also turn the bandsaw table back to 90 degrees and then cut another rough face to make a rough 90-degree corner, and then mill that corner nice and square at the jointer. But for me, it's just as easy to complete the rest of the squaring process, 2 faces, right here at the jointer. So we've got all of our fresh cut faces from the bandsaw. We need to get that face flat first. I've got 2 different boards here on the jointer to talk about 2 different situations you might encounter as you're running boards through the jointer. This board has a convex bottom surface, meaning that its contact points are somewhere in the middle and not on the ends. So if I push down on this end, it's going to raise that end of the board. So in this case, if I was to continually put downward pressure on the infeed side and start my cut with pressure on the infeed, push it through the cutting edge and keep pressing on the back side over here, once again on the infeed, then as I do that, it's still going to lift up as it goes through on the outfeed side of the jointer. I don't want that. Instead, I want to make sure that as the material is being cut, the downward pressure stays on the outfeed side of the jointer only. Once I have outfeed downward pressure established, I don't ever want to go back to the infeed side to put downward pressure. Now, in this case, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to ever put pressure down on the front. So even when I start, I'm going to start wherever it's most solid. I'm going to put downward pressure right here and continuously pass this through, and it's going to maybe nibble just a little bit at the front and then take a deeper cut back here. And I'll establish the downward pressure on the outfeed side no further than this point on this board. That'll just basically let the front do whatever it wants to do without me ever having the notion of pushing down and changing my reference plane. This is already an established plane, so I'll maintain this pressure all the way through. Now, again, once I have this nice and flat to where it is contacting through its entire length, but maybe I need to take one more pass, at that point, if it is indeed contacting throughout its entire length, then I can start with my pressure up here. I've switched the boards around, and this board is the exact opposite situation as the first board. This piece has a concave bottom face so that the contact points are mostly on the front and the back. So in this case, I can have downward pressure on the front as I'm feeding things through. Now, until it is all the way supported on the outfeed side, I don't want to put downward pressure directly onto the cutter head. Even then, I still want to avoid having my hands over the cutter head. So I'll have downward pressure allowing it to establish on the outfeed, and once it is established on the outfeed, I can transition some force to the outfeed side pushing down and feed it through as I normally would. The last thing I want to mention before using the jointer, and this applies to basically any cutting edge that removes thickness. So chisels, planer, jointer, hand planes, you always want to cut in the downhill direction. And I've got this board here to represent what that means. You can see that the grain here is not perfectly horizontal. It has a angled direction to it. Now, not in the orientation where the board is level. What you want to do is twist it, and I'm looking at a monitor here to cheat. You want to twist it so that the grain is somewhat level. That determines your uphill and downhill direction. So for this board, with the grain being horizontal, I want to plane and joint and do all the cutting action in this direction, the downhill direction. Because if I don't, and I go in the uphill direction, what am I doing? If I hold the board level again, I'm trying to pull up that grain, and that's where you get tear out, and that's where you get a lot of problems. So always just take a second to briefly look at the direction of the grain and establish the downhill direction. So you want the cutting edge to be cutting into the downhill direction. Now, even though this jointer is a helical head jointer, which will reduce the amount of tear out you get on figured woods or woods where the grain is changing in various different directions, I do want to make sure that I have all of the grain being jointed in the downhill direction like I just said. So anytime you are using or batching out a bunch of pieces through a machine, it doesn't matter what machine it is, take the time to orient all the boards so that they are going to be fed in the proper direction without you even having to think about it. So in this case, I went through all of my pieces and I determined what the downhill direction was. So all I have to do without having to think about too much while the machine is running is grab each piece and cut it as normal. Everything should be in the appropriate direction, set up and ready to go before I even turn the machine on. Right off the jointer, we can take our pieces and run them through the planer with the jointed side face down, and this will make sure all of our pieces are a consistent thickness, and then also, most importantly, it'll transfer that flat face from the jointer to the opposite face, so we'll have a nice parallel board. Now, it's important to make sure that you are also planing in the downhill direction, just like we were jointing in the downhill direction. The main reason why we went from the jointer to flatten one face to the planer to get an opposite face nice and parallel and flat back to the jointer is that gives us more reference faces up against the fence, more options, so that we can verify that we are cutting in the downhill direction. If instead we just stayed at the jointer and took that freshly jointed face and put it up against the fence, and let's just say that our board made us cut in the uphill direction, well, the only option we have for an adjustment is to flip it end for end while maintaining that same face up against the fence. And when you flip a board end for end, it doesn't change your cutting direction. The only time you change your cutting direction when it comes to opposite faces is if you twist the board. So if we have two faces off of the planer, one that was jointed flat, the planer has the other one nice and flat and parallel, that gives us two reference faces that we can put up against the fence, and therefore gives us two different options as far as the cutting direction. So if we were previously forced to cut uphill, now we can cut downhill. When it comes to jointing the adjacent face 90 degrees, all of the same rules apply as far as downward pressure and making sure everything runs smoothly on the outfeed side of the table. But we also need to make sure that we take that nice flat face and maintain consistent pressure up against the fence. Everything's the same, except we have to make sure that the fence remains in contact with the wood at all times. The material we selected for the legs turned out to be fantastic. It is really straight grain stuff. There's no defects. The little bit of sapwood that is in a couple of these, I forget which one, I think it's this one, is not going to be a problem one bit. We still have two legs on the bottom insides that we can hide some of the defects. So we're in a really good position with these legs. Now, we milled everything to be about 1/16 of an inch thick in both directions for these.
And the reason for that is so we'll let them set it overnight, sticker stack them, and then come back and mill the rest of it out later.
Yeah, so these will actually sit for a couple days probably due to our schedule. But those couple days that they're going to sit, we just introduced brand new wood to the shop atmosphere here, so it may have released some type of internal stresses, or they may further acclimate to the shop. So when we have an opportunity to work with them next to do the joinery on them, at that point we'll do a final milling to get them down to their exact thickness, and any type of bow, cup, or twist that was introduced while they were sitting, we still have a little bit of thickness left over to remove all of those defects. While the leg pieces rest, we start milling the rails and stiles. Luckily, we were able to find a wide board that had very few defects, but unfortunately, with a wider board, you generally have inconsistent grain appearance along its width. So on the plus side, we will have great color consistency throughout this board, but on the downside, we will have to be a little bit more selective with where each part is cut out. To maximize the yield, I took my original SketchUp model and laid out as many pieces that would fit on a rectangle sized to the usable dimensions of the board. This gives me rough cut locations to start the milling process, and of course, the milling process is exactly the same as what I've already shown. This diagram shows all of the next pieces we need laid out on that single board, and we just made the initial cross-cutting to bring this larger board down to much more manageable sized pieces. So, for example, this is the 14-inch wide section, so right here, or 14 inches long. Now we have to lay out for the pieces that are on the inside of this, and in this case, on this 14-inch long piece, all we have are the two short pieces These are actually the rails for both of the upper doors. So we want the rails to remain consistent with the stiles for the doors. And if I know that according to the board we just cut up, if we stay to one side of the board, then we'll have some really nice straight grain. And if I match all these pieces, like this note says here, both doors cut from the same side. So after I made all my initial rough cuts, I noticed on this board that it leans heavy on one side as far as straight grain. So we've got some cathedral going on here with some of this flat sawn area, and then this is rift sawn, so we've got some nice straight lines. So if we kind of make a center line down the cathedral, and if that's a center line, then somewhere right around here should be this, all this in between my fingers should be symmetrical. Whatever we cut here should match well with what we cut here. That means all this stuff over here is extra. That's convenient because I'm going to put all of the doors in this area on all of my pieces. The doors are going to look great. Nice straight grain. It's just going to look beautiful. So for the rest of this stuff, we need to make one initial rip cut at the bandsaw to separate these two boards. And that rip cut will be less than 8 inches on this side, which is the capacity of my jointer. So that's convenient. And on this side, it's only going to be enough for those particular parts, in this case, the doors. So if we go with, let's see, we need 1.5 and 1.5 pieces. That's 3 inches. Let's just go ahead and go with 3.5. That gives us a little bit of extra leeway to mill this edge as well as the blade curve. So let's mark a line at 3.5 and cut all of our pieces from this board so that we remove just the straight grain side and leave another board that is less than 8 inches with the cathedrals. That's it for the first video in this series. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it so far. And if you want to see more, the next video is going to be the mortise and tendon joints on the legs. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Share it with all of your friends. I surely won't complain if you do that. And then also check out my website, jayscustomcreations.com, to get caught up on everything that I publish. I publish a lot more there than what you see on YouTube, which is kind of crazy. I was just looking today. I have 777 posts on my website. It's kind of crazy how things just snowball and time flies. But anyway, huge shout out to Sean Stone. He was the other gentleman in this video. A good friend of mine, local friend of mine. Be sure to check out his website, stoneandsonsworkshop.net. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Yeah.